Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is episode 5 in Debunking Gladwell's analysis of Amanda Knox. And the title of the episode is Most of Us Aren't Very Good at Lie Detection. Really. So, we back to Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell's best-selling book. And he's now talking kind of in a general sense about the ability of people in general to recognize liars, right? So in the excerpt, Gladwell talks about, on average, judges correctly identify liars 54% of the time, slightly better than chance. He says that students are terrible. I think what he means is students are terrible lie detectors, and FBI agents are terrible, and CIA officers are terrible, lawyers are terrible. I'm not sure I agree with that. So here's Gladwell's opinion is that most of us aren't very good at lie detection. So I'm not sure really what he means. He's talking about the Amanda Knox case, and he's saying most of us aren't very good at lie detection. And if there's one thing that sort of almost defines the Knox case, it's the lying. And that was a big thing that kind of alerted the police to the fact that there was a problem, the fact that there were different versions, the fact that even with Solicitor, he gave one version, and then the next thing he would give a reporter another version. The police would read in the newspaper, the Mirror, I think it was the Sunday Mirror, a different version of events, right? So So if we look at especially, high-profile cases like Amanda Knox, like Chris Watts, like Jodi Arias, this whole idea that people can't tell when other people are lying just seems a little bit naive. I do think we need to separate lie detection in the sort of milieu of the everyday world, or the sort of normal environment, and true crime. And I think that's a really cardinal separation. I think it's a really important separation. And kind of what that means is, I think Gladwell is correct that we aren't good at lie detection. And what I mean is, in our ordinary lives, when we are, say, involved in a romantic relationship or a marriage, or just in sort of ordinary sort of intercourse with different people, I'm talking about social intercourse, I don't think we're very good at lie detection. I don't think we're programmed to expect people to lie to us. And I don't think we are programmed to lie either. So although I think there's a lot of lying going on in society, and a lot of it is subconscious, I think most people consider themselves honest and think of other people as honest, and this is why they're not good at deciphering the lies. But the reason I have a problem with Gladwell isn't because of the assessment that generally people are poor lie detectors. I have a problem because he's conflating that with a true crime case, and he's saying that in terms of someone who was under suspicion, it wasn't obvious that she was lying, right? If we just take her accusation of Patrick Lumumba, it was obvious within about 2 weeks that was a false accusation. That's not something that is, that's an extraordinary thing to happen in a high profile murder case. Um, if you if you consider some of the other cases that we can think about, Jodi Arias, she implicated ninjas in a scenario, but no one was arrested. She didn't name someone specific. In the Chris Watts case, he implicated his wife, saying that she murdered the children, but she wasn't arrested. She had died. But my point is, what's extraordinary about the Amanda Knox case is her accusation actually led to the arrest of somebody, and his life was destroyed. He lost his livelihood and that kind of thing. So this whole idea that that people, I'm talking about the people reporting on the case, I'm talking about the officers investigating the case, and the public watching the case, and then even the members of the court that heard the first trial and the jury, they were under the impression that Amanda Knox wasn't being honest, and she wasn't being honest. There were all sorts of different stories about whether they were at home at this time, and I'm not going to go through them. I mean, one can show the different adaptations and even go through email at home and so on, and how they don't line up. The point is that it's no big mystery that what was being said was it wasn't difficult to find out that it wasn't true, right? And then there were a lot of other things. There was also the talk about that Meredith always locked her door, and so on. So I don't think that it's true or applicable in true crime that most of us aren't very good at lie detection. I think a very good example of this is when Chris Watts gave his sermon on the porch. This was one day after his family had supposedly disappeared. Pretty much everyone knew that he was lying. There was almost a unanimous sense that everyone seemed to know he was lying except him. And so how does that apply to this thing that most of us aren't very good at lie detection? So I don't think this applies to true crime, and I think Malcolm Gladwell is off track in sort of associating this with true crime. I'm the first to say I think I'm a good lie detector in terms of my work in true crime and my analysis in true crime, but I can also say in real life, in sort of experiences with people, I'm definitely less good at telling whether people are liars. Sometimes you think they are and they're not, and sometimes you know they aren't and they are. There's some behavior from family members, from people one is romantically involved with, that just doesn't make any sense. And in criminal scenarios you can understand why people lie, but in sort of just civilian intercourse, it doesn't make sense always why people just wouldn't be either honest or are less than honest. So I think on this first point, it just, again, it's a dubious point to be making, and it's not just Amanda Knox that wasn't completely honest here, and even this year, about her wedding, wasn't completely honest. It's also Solicitor. He made claims that were difficult to prove. He made claims about being asleep till a certain time, about his father calling him on a landline, all sorts of claims that weren't proved. So it's a difficult thing that Gladwell's making a point that just seems difficult to sort of to understand, even why he made it. I think one of the central aspects to the Amanda Knox case that demystifies it and sort of makes it far more explicable is as soon as you intuit the case from through the sort of um, lens of drug use and a sort of a drug lifestyle, then a lot makes sense. Not only erratic behavior, but also um, um, the propensity to lie. So, and what I mean is, what always surprises me is when you have someone who's caught out or who is under the spotlight, and someone is now looking for them to, are you going to be honest or not? And then they're sort of lying as a matter of course. They're sort of habitual lying, and for someone who's honest, a habitual lie doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like, but I can see you lying. Why are you persisting with it? Obviously, if someone lies and they keep lying, it works for them, in some way, or it did work for them in some way. Now, what I wanna do is I wanna conflate that with someone who's a drug addict and someone who lies as an everyday consequence of being a drug addict. So in other words, on a daily basis, you're covering up the fact that you're taking drugs which you shouldn't be doing, and everything that's around that. And so, as a matter of course, you start lying about everything: what you're doing, where you're doing it, what time you were somewhere, what's happening to your money, why you're in a certain mood. Everything just gets the sort of lying treatment to cover up the fact that you're doing drugs, and that you shouldn't be doing drugs, but you want to continue to be doing drugs. So you're going to mislead and minimize and learn all these clever little techniques so that you can persist in your little hedonistic scheme. So some of the best liars in the world are drug addicts, and one of the reasons why they're so good is they have had a lifetime of lying, and it's in a way psychopathic. So I'm not saying someone who was on drugs or is on drugs is a psychopath. I'm saying what happens when someone's on drugs is lying becomes second nature, and second nature to such an extent that there's no there's no prick of conscience, there are no bones about lying, and in that sense it's psychopathic. It is being able to tell a lie without blinking an eye, and that separates drug addicts from the rest of us. Most of the rest of us don't need to lie every single day about every single thing we're doing and do it with ease. Drug addicts do that, right? And so when a drug addict is in a situation where something else has happened, it's quite easy to default to lying and wriggling out of it, just saying what you think the other person wants to hear, right? So if we go to the next point that Gladwell makes, he says there may be a handful of super detectors, and yeah, he's talking about there are some people who are sort of experts at discerning liars, right? And yes, there are. There are folks like Joe Kender, aka Homicide Hunter, and John Douglas, aka Mind Hunter. But profiling isn't a skill you're born with. It's one that's honed, and although one does need a knack for pattern recognition and attention to detail, I believe anyone can learn it. I think some people can be taught it and won't apply it necessarily that well, and some people can be naturals at it. But I don't think that you can sort of snap your fingers and just say someone will be a sort of natural lie detector. It is something that you need experience with. The telltale signs of it, there are a couple of obvious ways that people lie, including giving extraneous information. Certain body language cues, like the upper bodies would freeze, right, and someone would be staring at you longer than they otherwise would. Sometimes it's extravagant gestures, arm waving and that sort of thing. Um, Sometimes it's micro expressions. These aren't really applicable when you talking to someone, just because you're not likely to catch them in that way. You can pick up micro expressions when playing back footage and when slowing it down, and that might be things like licking lips and lip snarls and um, blinking at certain points, and when making certain comments, and then the body language actually mismatches with it. So, for example, um, confirming something while shaking your head, or the opposite. So yeah, so all of those things um, do apply, but it still doesn't mean that if you're aware of them that you're going to be some kind of super detector. But the point is that it can be learned, and people do get better at it, over time. So I think the whole concept of super detectors isn't like some kind of Marvel superhero that's sort of born with some kind of mutant power. Some people do have a aptitude for it, but as I say, I think it's really something that can be learned. It's a little bit like handwriting analysis. Once you know the basics, when you know that um, certain things represent certain things, it becomes easier. Now, if we look at other aspects with lying, it it sometimes involves jumbling the tenses, and dissociated language, where you don't refer to a person by their first name or that sort of thing. Another aspect that I certainly have found through my sort of research into lie detection is how people use symbolic language and colorful language, and how that is a giveaway. But for one person, colorful language is going to be a red flag, and for another one, not necessarily. For one person, a slip of a tongue may be a Freudian slip, and for another, it might just be someone who stutters. And that's also quite important to note, is that not every what's the word? Not every sign is a sign of mendacity, but you often don't get a mendacity without a sign. So, for example, the for example, if some criminals have a trademark telltale giveaway when they're not honest, and I'll give an example. I'm not going to mention his name because the case is still under appeal, but there's a particular convicted murderer at this point who has like a nervous facial tic. He would blink his eyes quite emphatically, right? And often when you could tell that he was being caught out in a lie, or he was trying to do that, he would also blink. That doesn't mean that every time he's blinking he's lying, but what it does mean is every time he's blinking like that, one needs to give it a second glance, because he might be, and so that's a good way of quickly checking up on that. So with Amanda Knox, for example, what one notices with her, in some interviews, she's asked, well, in one in particular, she's asked about the fact that a judge had contended that not only was she at the scene of the murder, but she was the one who actually killed Meredith Kircher. The response is to smile, and that's not a smoking gun scenario, but can you imagine if you were on TV and you've been traumatized by false accusations and you've spent time in jail for a crime you didn't commit, and this is your opportunity to defend yourself, and someone says, you know, this is what you were accused of. Would you really break out into a smile? You know, like you can't actually hold the smile back. It's so delightful. You know, most people accused of murder falsely aren't going to have a sense of humor about it. They're going to have a sense of anger about it, right? So going through Gladwell's, just going through some of the rest of what he was saying, he talks about Knox being an innocent person who acts guilty, and that she's mismatched. But what I want to talk about here is he basically asked the rhetorical question, what was Amanda Knox's problem? And he answers it by saying she was mismatched. I don't think that's Amanda Knox's problem. I mean, I think that's a very odd way of controlling his own narrative and sort of trying to shape the thinking of his reader by saying, by framing it like that, by saying, what was Amanda Knox's problem, and then answering it, she was mismatched, and then saying she's the innocent person who acts guilty. If we take the question at face value and we say, what was Amanda Knox's problem? I think I think it's important to try to answer that question, and one way of answering it is to go into Amanda Knox's backstory and to say, you know, was she a happy child? Was she a happy kid in high school? Did she have a good home life? You know, were things good on the home front? And in particular, when she went to Italy, where was she in the world? Like what was her situation like? And when you answer those questions seriously, you see that there was a lot that wasn't very good. Her biological father left the family when her sister was, I think, born, and she was 2 years old. And this created a scandal. So she was brought up by a single mom, and they struggled financially. And then her mother also eventually dated kind of a younger man, and I think there was a sort of a sense of that you know, he was almost young enough to be Amanda Knox's brother in a sense. But I mean, what this causes is kind of confusion about, you know, how does a woman sort of deal with men? And one can sort of argue that Amanda Knox wasn't the most streetwise in many respects, but especially with the opposite sex. And she took that into Italy with disastrous effects. You know, it's not just, wow, I'm a bit awkward around guys or whatever it is. It's, I'm staying with 3 other women who all have boyfriends, and one of them likes a guy I like, but I can't get his interest because I'm strange. And also, because I'm strange, I can't either maintain the interest of a male, and you know, this is in terms of her, or even other females. And then you say, what was Amanda Knox's problem? And then isn't the answer insecurity? Isn't the answer insecurity based on this sense of insufficiency which started in the home? And then you come back to just a very simple and obvious and almost cliched scenario of, you know, a broken home leading to sort of a somewhat broken, dysfunctional person. And this person is now living with other people who aren't dysfunctional, who aren't broken, and who are noticing that this person's odd and doesn't respond in social ways, in appropriate ways, and who, um, you know, turns off people, alienates people. And what happens when you alienate people? You end up being isolated. And isn't that what happened with Amanda Knox? She was eventually living outside of her own home, and her roommates, plural, weren't terribly happy with her, right, at that point. So does that answer what was Amanda Knox's problem? I think it kind of does, and I think it kind of answers it beyond the sort of smug way that the question is asked. In other words, that she didn't have a problem, and that there is no problem. So that brings us to another point that Gladwell makes, which is that Knox was confusing. I think that's true when you don't know her. So Knox was confusing in terms of her odd behavior, but in another way, if you bring in the drug narrative, and you bring in the fact that this is a 20-year-old American who's not allowed to drink alcohol in America, but in Europe she is, then you have this situation of, well, I'm going to enjoy myself now, but I'm young and I'm not used to this. It's not that confusing. It was pretty clear what was going on with Amanda Knox. She wanted attention. She liked attention. And so, this notion that that Knox is sort of this confusing personality, I don't think that's the case. I think it's pretty clear what was going on. And it didn't take a genius, for someone living with her to see what was going on. So what was confusing about it? Gladwell then goes on to say that Amanda Knox was actually a bit of a misfit, almost as if he's providing a revelation here, as though he's saying, well, there are all these problems we don't understand, but guess what? The answer is that Amanda Knox was actually a misfit. Not actually, it was obvious. The whole goofy narrative, which is so well known, it's a cliche in terms of the Amanda Knox case. The whole she was goofy. That's why she behaved in the way she did. So this isn't a revelation that she was a misfit. And what's interesting is Gladwell is sort of using this this label essentially to explain why Knox why it just made no sense to suspect her of the crime, because she was a misfit. That lets her off the hook. All her strange behavior is because of goofiness. What he's not acknowledging yet again is the fact that if you look at the other side of the coin, then you see, well, who would be more motivated to have a bone to pick with Meredith than a misfit, someone who's not as popular as Meredith is, someone who's not as comfortable with other people, including men and women, as Meredith is, someone who's not as sort of happy and comfortable and whatever and functional in the world as Meredith was. And it didn't only apply to sort of those things, it also applied to studying at university. Meredith was more on her way in that sense than Knox. She all Amanda Knox was studying was some kind of basic course in Italian, a language course, whereas Meredith had already done that and she was now taking it further. So, where does the misfit narrative take you? It takes you to a place of someone being invalidated by someone else, someone feeling inferior to, jealous of, all those kind of things. And so the misfit narrative goes much further to answer questions around the possibility of a crime than it does to dismiss those questions, right? And then Gladwell goes on to sort of quote Knox, where she says she was a quirky kid who hung out with sulky manga readers and ostracized gay kids and the theater geeks. And what I think's really not acknowledged in the Knox thing is, if you read her memoir, she sort of describes Solicitor in this very romantic sense as her sort of her Italian Harry Potter, that he was this cultured, handsome, perfect guy. But the reality was, Celeste didn't have a girlfriend. Essentially, Amanda Knox was his first girlfriend. He was also a quirky kid, in inverted commas. He was also a kind of ostracized kid. And so, yeah, you have two misfits hanging out. And then you talk about Rudy Gaudet and you say, well, what about him? Did he have a lot of friends? Was he in some sort of socially cohesive scenario? Did he have a career? And now you essentially have three misfits. And what are they all united in? Well, their drug use. And does that lead to kind of a toxic and potentially catastrophic climax? That's the question. Did it? Could it? Right? So what I also think, and this is coming back to you having kind of a civilian guy writing about someone who he thinks is a civilian, and he's sort of talking about it, that Amanda Knox was a misfit, so the whole all the suspicion around it just should be dismissed. It should just be evaporate, right? But the fact is, most criminals are misfits. If you just go through the list and you look at, say, Jodi Arias, she's a misfit. You look at Oscar Pistorius, he was a misfit as well. You look at Chris Watts in terms of the way that his peers looked at him, the way his wife looked at him. People said that he has no game and that he was sort of quiet, and he was in a real sense a misfit, right? Another classic case is the West Memphis Three. With them, you have a scenario where people are saying, or people were saying, that because they were misfits, they were seen as suspicious or guilty. And actually, on the face of it, that's not a bad point of departure. It's more likely that your misfits are going to have a bone to pick with someone and have a motive and have a score to settle and be agitated and be unhappy about something than someone who's happy in society and loved and accepted. So if anything, when you come across a misfit in the context of a criminal situation, you need to pay attention. You need to pay attention to what's going on there. Another example is Casey Anthony. Was she like a normal young lady kind of thing? And we know that she was pretending to go to work for months and months and months. She was pretending to have a job. So the misfit thing is really important. If we go to the next thing, Gladwell refers to high school, where Knox was on financial aid. She's surrounded by well-heeled classmates, but she's on financial aid, and so you kind of even had a situation that's institutionalized. She's at school and she feels inferior. She's at school and everyone is having a better sort of go of it, where they get what they want and she doesn't. And you can bet your bottom dollar that that's not a fun situation to be in. It's not fun to be on the outs. It's not fun to struggle when everyone around you is, on the red carpet to wherever they want to go. It's not nice, right? It's not a nice situation. And so the fact that this had been ongoing before she even got to Italy also points to the sense that, someone can get really unhappy when they find out that they're once again in a situation where they can't find happiness, they can't get what they want, and all the more reason then to turn to drugs. I'm not getting the kick I want out of life, so I'm going to get it from substances, right? This brings us to Gladwell referring to mismatched people being confusing and unpredictable. Again, I really don't understand how he thinks here, because unpredictable behavior is nevertheless predictable. So with Amanda Knox, when you get to know her, what you start to realize is, she's already made one confession which she's sort of not sticking to. Then she makes another one, and then you can kind of reasonably expect her to make another one, and she does. And you can kind of reasonably expect her to make another one, and she does. She behaves strangely outside the villa, where she's sort of cozying up to her boyfriend, and then later on she is buying lingerie. You can kind of believe that, and then it just goes on. There talks about who she slept with, and that's sort of a whole narrative on its own. There's a goofy narrative, there's a sex narrative, there's a lying narrative, there's the narrative of all the confessions, and all of it is this confusing thing, but I wouldn't say it's unpredictable. You can see that it's happening. I mean, the confusing unpredictability of the Knox case is mirrored in the court narrative. Conviction, acquittal, conviction, acquittal. It's not rocket science. You can, another good example of that is Chris Watts, where you see, he's not confusing or unpredictable. People can tell that he makes false confessions. It's not confusing, it's something that you can kind of expect, right? Even Amanda Knox's recent appeal for money for her wedding is part of that whole narrative of someone who's not confusing and unpredictable. Her unpredictability is predictable. Her confusing behavior is predictable. So I think it's a bit strange. So I'm not really going to take it further than that in this episode, but I am going to just refer to another commentator just referring to Gladwell's book and just being also a little bit mystified by it. This is Anthony Cummins, and he wrote an article, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell Review, and he calls it a weirdly pathologizing jargon. And if you look up the word pathologizing, it basically refers to psychologically abnormal, right? So if you're talking about some of Gladwell's views, this particular writer is saying that it's kind of an abnormal jargon that the author is using. That it's it's psychologically strange. That's kind of what he's saying. Not strange like in the brilliant sense, or strange that it's sort of like spot on and it's brilliant. It's strange. It's strange. It's a bit odd, right? And then he talks about how the latest book tackles our struggle to make sense of other people. There's something ironic about this. There's something ironic about a dude writing a book about our struggle to make sense of other people, and the guy seemingly getting some of it wrong. I've got a lot of respect for Gladwell. I've really enjoyed many of his other books. But I don't really have a criticism so much of Talking to Strangers, but specifically the chapter on Amanda Knox, and that's why it's so ironic. Is that his book is tackling how we struggle to make sense of other people, but Gladwell genuinely seems to be struggling to make sense out of Amanda Knox, and not just her, the case as well. So just to highlight a few aspects from the article, the reporter refers to some of Gladwell's comparisons being absurd, and that he labels Knox and Hitler as example of mismatched people. So he's sort of like got, as his sort of little collection of oddballs, he's got Amanda Knox and Hitler. That's odd in itself. I mean, that's an odd way to do it in itself, you know. And what I really appreciate with this reporter, and the reason I'm quoting it is, although it's my opinion, I think if I had to say it, one would say, well, you're just biased, you believe this or that or the next thing. But the point is, what this writer is saying is common sense. And what he says is, the question of who and what we are ready to believe often turns on who we are, right? In other words, he's talking about identity here. And so in terms of Amanda Knox, when we say, who and what we believe, who and what we believe about her, that turns on who she actually was, and that's why I sort of described her backstory. Where does that insecurity come from? Where does that insufficiency come from? It comes from somewhere, and so who you are has a impact on what you do and what you believe, and the same applies to us. I mean, who we are also, has an impact on what we're going to believe and what we're going to believe about someone else. So just to quote the report, he writes that he gives an example of Gladwell's take on Knox's acquittal, and he says, there never was a plausible explanation for why an immature, sheltered middle-class girl from Seattle would be interested in engaging in murderous sex games with a troubled drifter she barely knew, as if Rudy Gaday's interest in killing was a given. So I really appreciate this, is that he's basically saying, let's just look at Amanda Knox and just see, well, because she was sheltered, she would never have done this. It's actually the opposite. It's sheltered people that don't have experience with the world, that are amateurs with other people and amateurs with themselves and amateurs in situations and amateurs in terms of various experiences that deal with them in a maladaptive way, in often a criminal way. So we know that was true with Knox, that she was very inexperienced. We know that was true with Solicitor, who was also very inexperienced with the opposite sex, and Rudy Gaday was naive and inexperienced in other ways, and one might sort of say that he was naive in terms of the world beyond drug addicts and selling drugs to people, right? So in other words, there was sort of a corridor in which he was very familiar with, but beyond that he wasn't. And I think that's also relevant. So yeah, it does. I agree with the reporter that it does seem a bit convenient that he sort of seems to imply that Gaday's interest in crime and killing is a given, and then you have the simplistic approach to Knox. Just because she's immature, that disqualifies her from doing certain things. I mean, if you look at someone like Jodi Arias and even Oscar Pistorius, are they the most mature people in the world? One could also argue that it's their immaturity, especially in dealing with the opposite sex, that got them into trouble. So the report concludes by saying, we see the shortcomings of Gladwell's weirdly pathologizing jargon as well as his habit of building an argument via juxtaposition. And so in other words, Gladwell kind of excels in this, is that he juxtaposes things, and sometimes those juxtapositions are absurd. And the slightly disorientating thing about the chapter on Amanda Knox is how much isn't about Amanda Knox. He cites someone called Nervous Nelly, he cites Bernie Madoff, and then he's trying to sort of conflate these people with Amanda Knox, and it's there are juxtapositions that I'm not sure are very very apt. I mean, if you're going to compare a high-profile criminal, compare them to another high-profile criminal. I think I think Gladwell is good with his juxtapositions, but he can sometimes see. I think there's some. Is it cognitive bias? It's where you see what you want to see, or you see your point, not necessarily the reality as it was. So so that concludes episode 5. I've kind of gone through it much lighter than a lot of the other episodes where I went into the evidence in quite a lot of detail. I could have done that, but I don't want every episode to be an hour and a half or 2 hours. I recommend those that are interested in these videos and just in the commentary to go and have a look at Despicable, the first trial and conviction. It's the first in a trilogy of books on Amanda Knox. And I worked quite hard to look for the motive of the murder of Meredith Kercher. The book is very highly rated. It's got a 10 reviews, and the rating is 4.9 out of 5 stars. So you're going to get a really good narrative out of that, and I want to encourage you, if you haven't read the book already, just to head on over and give it a read. There at the moment 3 books in the series. Despicable deals with the original conviction with quite a lot of evidence in the first trial, and then it deals with the very interesting fight back, the very interesting defense strategy from the Knox camp. Everything from hair, cutting her hair, to dress code, just to changing her image to suit a sort of a more conservative approach, but also the conservative audience that is folks sitting in an Italian court. So please have a look at that. Extradition is the 3rd book in the series, which deals with effectively the 3rd hearing, and then the question or the possibility that was hanging in the air. Would there be an extradition? And Knox obviously said, if I'm found guilty, they'll have to take me back, kicking and screaming. Which I think also talks a little bit about that sort of cocky nature that Knox can sometimes have. think about it. You in on trial in absentia for murder. You've already published your book, and you're not going to bother to go to the country and testify. You're not going to go on the stand and say, but you are going to engage the media while it's going on and sort of undermine the trial from a distance, right? It takes a specific kind of person to do that. A specific kind of person who's good at, you know, covering for themselves, minimizing things, and arguably getting away with things, right? So, yeah, please have a look at that book. It's available on Amazon Kindle. And thanks a lot for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the channel. Click on the bell, like, and leave a comment. And look forward to seeing your comments and getting on to the next episode in this debunk series.